Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. I think a perfect way to follow up a video about obscure horror movies, most of which are generally considered either not considered at all or considered really bad. Um, but I love anyway, and I find their structure really interesting and fascinating to look at. I think the best way to follow that up is to talk about style versus content, which is a sort of debate that comes up every once in a while. I watched the Edinburgh World Writing Conference videos. They put up a lot of videos online, a couple hours worth of lectures and debates. My dogs are barking from the inside because I won't let them out because they're so barky. But they put a couple of hours worth of material on YouTube, so I watched a bunch of it. And there's one, and this I think it was from 2013. Ali Smith gives a great, very entertaining speech about style versus content. And it must have been some kind of a trend in 2013 because everybody was throwing puns all over the place. Puns must have been really popular in 2013. I don't know. But Ali Smith is great. She's very entertaining, very intense and passionate. But she and China Mieville in that same conference both mentioned this thing Paul Coelho said. I think it's Coelho. I'm going on their pronunciation. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. But this thing Paul Coelho said about James Joyce, about style versus content. Because Paul Coelho said that James Joyce ruined literature because it was all style and no content. And the ironic thing about the word content and substance, those two words, content and substance, is that they're meaningless mostly, or they're either meaningless entirely, or they have such a floating protean definition that they're entirely impractical. Another the trend in a lot of these speeches at the EWWC was lots and lots and lots of puns, huge vocab word thrown in unnecessarily, but then a really basic point at the core. China Mieville, he writes a lot of books that are definitely my style of books. Ali Smith, she has a lot of stories that are my style. You know, they're both, fantastic at what they do. But their speeches were very pun heavy. But they had some basic points to them that, but I've found that with just creative writing education, just generally, or any sort of speech about creative writing, if you break it down to what the actual core point is, it's a very simple, basic point. But content and the words content and substance are highly impractical words to use. But if you take a look at what Paul Coelho, at least, makes it something fairly precise. He's entirely wrong, but he makes it something at least precise enough that we could use it as a measure. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about the availability heuristic and reversing polarity in order to shake yourself out of your prejudices when it comes to assessing any sort of artwork, story, novel, whatever. Paul Coelho, he's saying Joyce lacks content in direct comparison to his own work. His own work is much more didactic. Paul Coelho is one of those, The Alchemist especially is one of those books where it always shows up on bestsellers of all time list, but for whatever reason it doesn't have as much penetration in the US so that it's so pervasive. Like if you ask people what are the most important books, if you ask people in the US what are the most important books, they might not mention The Alchemist, but The Alchemist is almost always on the top 5 best-selling books of all time or whatever. So it's a fascinating contrast there. But primarily what he's doing, it reminds me, there was a period I was reading a lot of Herman Hesse books because my brother Paul loves Herman Hesse books, and they're fine. I like them. I like them fine for what they are. It's not normally something that I would choose to pick up, but because my brother liked him, I grew this appreciation for Herman Hesse. These Bildungsroman, again, a word I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly at all. But these Bildungsroman, you'd have a character who goes through this learning experience, and essentially the drive of the narrative is that this character grows and learns and becomes, more mature, learns how to deal with the world, learns some basic philosophy. It could be based on a particular religion, like in Siddhartha, it's Buddhism. There's tons of Bildungsroman where somebody learns Christianity, or somebody learns to abandon Christianity, or somebody learns, whatever. The main character goes on this journey of growth. So presumably that's what Paul Coelho was talking about. That his idea of content is that somebody grows and learns, and therefore the audience grows and learns and understands the world better. And sometimes you'll hear people say this story lacks substance, but based on the idea that it was just fluffy escapism. It was all surface level, stimulation. And I think that's one of the obstacles with me using the word stimulation all the time and talking about the basic value of the text, because there are multiple levels of stimulation. A lot of the times when people think about stimulation, like, the horror movies I was just talking about, they think, that's just, there's no substance to that, that's just style, and that's all. But what does substance actually mean there? That's the type of use of the word substance is very loosely defined. Does it mean that characters are learning and growing? Does it mean that, the reader comes to a greater understanding of the universe by reading this particular story? It's this very, very, very loose definition. And a lot of times in that context, it's used not necessarily in reference to learning, so intellectual stimulation. A lot of the times in that context, it's used in reference to deep level emotion. So horror movies, just by their very nature, tend to have a looser connection with the main character. One of the things, arguably, that defines a horror movie and separates it from a tragedy. So you don't quite have as deep a level connection to the character. So does content and substance mean deeper level emotional connection, or does it mean learning and growing and understanding the world better? What does substance actually mean? Sometimes you'll hear this phrase, I'm becoming a shadow. I'm becoming a shadow because the world is so dark. There you go. Yeah, the lighting is really weird right now. I like it. I like this weird lighting. This is style over substance. Hopefully I have some substance here. The shadows keep getting real weird. I like it. It's creepy. I'm all shadow now. So anyway, so is the substance and content, does that mean deep level emotional connection? Does substance and content mean learning about the world? And sometimes you hear this phrase, And the word human condition is another one that is just as protean or meaningless. But, I just heard it the other day. I can't remember what it was in reference to, but it was like, here's just this fluffy novel, and it's not like it analyzes the human condition or anything. Well, what does that mean? Is that really a value of a text? So you have a lot of these sort of loosely defined concepts. So what Ali Smith, her conclusion, and I think most writers, I don't know for sure, but I think most of our other writers, other than maybe Paul Coelho, would probably say is that it's inaccurate to set up those as a binary. Style and content are really intricately tied. You can't you just choose what is the pure style. I mean, and Nathan Englander said this in the introduction too, but you can't really choose what is the pure style text. You can't really say what is the pure content text. Writing is just an intermarriage of those two things. But even then, you need a much clearer definition of what content means in order to really make an argument that it's necessary. So, and this is what I appreciate about at least Coelho, even though he's entirely wrong, at least he gives parameters for what content actually means. So it arguably the reason why The Alchemist is really popular as compared to, and you can think of Herman Hesse in this sense too. The reason those books are really popular, and as compared to, any other Bildungsroman, or whatever self-help book or what have you, is because of the style, because they're enjoyable to read. So how can you extricate those? And James Joyce, even though I'm not personally a fan of James Joyce, I don't enjoy his work at all. How can you say that Ulysses is just style and no content? If you're defining it in the way Paul Coelho is, I can understand that. But in terms of content, I think a better definition of content would identify Ulysses as having content. I would say just a better definition of content is to recognize different types of stimulation. There is that fleeting sort of stimulation that comes more commonly with horror movies, where you have a looser connection with the characters, where stimulation comes from moments of violence or moments of fear or what have you. There you go. Now you can see me. Sort of. Come from moments of violence, moments of fear. These spikes of stimulation. And I mentioned, like, Terrifier, one of the horror movies I mentioned in the previous episode. You don't really have a huge connection with the characters, but you have these pretty, and that's typical of a thrasher movie. You have these spikes in acts of violence. Oh, there you go. Hold on. Spikes and acts of violence. There you go. Spikes and acts of violence. That has that more fleeting sort of stimulation. That's just the nature of horror movies. But you have a more durable stimulation. And I think that's actually, arguably, that's actually what people are identifying when they talk about content. And I mentioned this with, like, 1984, for example. If you created a valuation system where learning things in intellectual stimulation and understanding the world better is the value, you might identify something like 1984 as being the king of all books. And that's an understandable position. Hold on, there you go. That's an understandable position. That's an arguable position, as opposed to content just not meaning anything clear at all. It's a wrong position, but it is at least an arguable position. By identifying that, by identifying intellectual stimulation and learning and growing and understanding the world better as your prime value in what makes a book a good book, you're eliminating a vast majority of books, like James Joyce. Even though I don't like him personally, entirely subjectively, I wouldn't go so far as to eliminate him from the great books of the world based on that principle. Certainly not. But what a lot of people will do is they'll say, another problem with that. Another problem with that is that if you're creating this gradient of great books based on learning about the world, the greatest books would have to be nonfiction books, I would imagine. The greatest books would have to be self-help books. And I would say, especially if you're creating this binary of style versus content, a great self-help book that has a more accurate educational content about the true nature of existence would have to be more valuable than any novel that communicates the same thing. What does the novel add that a great self-help book or philosophy book fails to add? All of the religious text would have to be far more important than any sort of artistic text. Just more purely artistic text, I should say. So the implications of that as a measurement system are untenable. But as I was saying, the more durable stimulation, that's what I was on, right? What you're really identifying with looking at like a Bildungsroman or like a 1984 or something like that, it's not necessarily that they're great books because they're better than more style-heavy books because they are more intellectually stimulating. What you're really identifying is just by being intellectually stimulating, they give you a variety of stimulation, which I think is valuable. Here's Spike. What do you think about that, Spike? He's on his own Bildungsroman out here in the yard. What you doing, Spike? I just saw birds of prey fly by, so you're gonna have to go inside so that eagles don't pick you up. While I'm out here, I could punch the eagles if they come down, or red-tailed hawks probably. If the red-tailed hawks come down and try to eat you, I will punch them while I'm out here. But when we go inside, I can't trust you to defend yourself against the red-tailed hawks. You haven't reached that part of your Bildungsroman yet where you can learn to fight red-tailed hawks just entirely on your own. Where was that? But yeah, what you're identifying, like with a Herman Hesse book, that whole development of a character into a more mature character, if the value system is just what does he learn about the world and how does he understand the world better, it's usually he. I mean, there's a secondary issue, of course. I mean, there's a entirely irrelevant issue that type of book tends to be heavily geared towards male characters. But anyway, so if you said the value of that book is what the character learns about the world, and that's the only value, then that's a very limited valuation system that eliminates a lot of books unnecessarily from being able to be great books. But if you recognize that the character learning and growing is a more durable stimulation than just the character running away from a thrasher or what have you. If Siddhartha had run across the clown from Terrifier and just ran away and survived and had witnessed these acts of violence, it would have been a fun book. It would have been an interesting book. It would have been a fun book, but it wouldn't have really durable stimulation. It would have these temporary spikes of stimulation that would just sort of fade away. whereas his, long-term growth and development as a character creates a more durable stimulation. So what people are really identifying, there you go, when they talk about substance and content, when they're talking about substance and content, a much more durable, a much more valuable, specific sort of valuation system would be to look at what about this particular thing that you're identifying as substance or content leads to a more durable form of stimulation that gives you long-term stimulation. So if you go back to a Thrasher movie or something, are you able to feel the same thing you did the first time? Whereas if you go back to like Siddhartha or something like that, is it able to, stimulate, or any other Herman Hesse book, is it able to stimulate, does it stick with you? Do you continue to get this sense, do you encounter something in your life that brings up that book and continues to stimulate you just years after the fact? So there you go. So yes, Ali Smith is totally right. There you go. Content and style are not opposites, but if you talk about content, what does content actually mean? Arguably, what people identify as style is that more short-term stimulation, and arguably what people identify as content is that more durable stimulation, that more long-lasting stimulation. So I would argue it's not learning about the world or whatever analysis of the human condition means. And another thing, this goes back to another video, confirmation bias shows up. So if you make the claim that a good book is one that analyzes the human condition, and if I were to say, well, how does blank 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 analyze the human condition, and why is that? What does that mean specifically? Very frequently what people will do is they'll have that concept and they'll force something to fit into that, using confirmation bias. Whereas if you genuinely treated that as an objective valuation system, most books, honestly, if you treated it honestly, most books would fail that most great books would fail that standard. Whereas if you said, does this have durable, long-lasting stimulation, you can take that and honestly apply that to a wide variety of great books, and it also integrates subjectivity into the scenario. Whereas learning about how the world works, it doesn't give you a whole lot of room for subjectivity, because the way the world works should be something objective. And I think, identifying the way that a Bildungsroman will be based on different belief systems. You'll have big Bildungsroman that are Buddhist, you'll have big Bildungsroman that are Christian, you'll have Bildungsroman that are atheist. If the value is that they teach you how the world works, isn't that objective in some way? Doesn't that go beyond our own perspective in some way? That should lead to some sort of objective measure. Whereas if you look at durable stimulation versus temporary stimulation, that integrates your own subjective experience. So I can recognize that I don't personally value Ulysses because, there was no stimulation at all, just for me. But I can recognize how others, the challenge of reading Ulysses and the experience of reading Ulysses had a much more long-lasting, durable stimulation than just, something that's just some popular text that's just, spikes in stimulation, really brief, temporary sort of spikes in stimulation. So that is a much more valuable system of evaluation and a much more practical system of evaluation, arguably. But anyway, enough rambling. See you on the next episode as I fade into shadow. See you in the next episode.